In this recording, I'm going to look at a certain type of class which is called an exception. An exception is a way of handling errors in a graceful and object-oriented way. And it's also how we'll be handling errors throughout the remainder of this course. Before we get into it though, some information first. I record in high resolution so you don't have to watch a blurry screen. Choose high definition if that works for you. Would you like to join a growing group of PHP developers and take your skills to a new level? If that sounds like you, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon, and welcome. I'm going to use an example which is similar to one that we used in chapter 3, and that was an inventory Json file. So in my chapter 4 folder, I'm creating a folder called files, and inside of there I'm creating a file called inventory.json. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try and access this file, and we're going to create exceptions for when the file cannot be accessed, for example if we give it a wrong name, and also a scenario where the JSON is not correctly formatted. In my chapter 4 folder, I already have a folder called utility. If you don't have that, if you haven't followed the previous lessons, just create that now. Inside of there, I'm creating a class called JSON file reader. And believe it or not, this is a utility class which is going to read JSON files. So I'm just going to add one method, and it's a public function, read file as associative array. It will take a string file name as the single argument, and it's expected to return an array. The way it's going to work is like this. I'm going to grab the content of the file using file get contents, and I just need to pass in the file name for that. So you might already be thinking, well, what if the file doesn't exist? And that's something we're going to handle. Then we're going to decode the file content into an associative array, and I can do that using JSON decode and then passing true as the second argument, which means decode this into an associative array. And then all I'm going to do is just return the items from there. So a couple of things which could go wrong there. The file get contents method won't work if there is no file, and JSON decode also won't work if the content is in the wrong format. Now I need somewhere to go and test this out. So inside of public, I'm going to create an index.php file. If you followed the previous lesson, you've probably already got an index.php file. It's perfectly okay to continue using that one. In here, I'm going to add my PHP tags. I will require once my autoload.php file. So I'm going to start a fairly happy path with a working example. I'll grab the JSON file reader with JSON file reader equals new JSON file reader, and it's the one from app utility in the chapter 4 folder. I actually have two JSON file readers in this project because I created one in chapter 3, but that's where namespaces comes to the rescue, I guess. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to grab the inventory by saying JSON file reader read file as associative array. I pass in the path to the inventory.json file, which is the correct folder and file name, and then I'm just going to print R, and hopefully we should be able to see this in the browser if I go and run it. I shall start up my local server in the public folder where the index file is located. So php -s localhost :port number. Let's go over and check this in the browser, and there we have an array of our items from the JSON file. Let's now go back to the index.php file, and we'll change the path to this file so that it doesn't work anymore. So I'm just changing the path from files to file system. Let's go back to the browser, refresh, and so we have a warning and a fatal error. The warning is saying there's no such file or directory. The fatal error is saying we have a type error because our method refile as associative array is expected to return an array, and in fact it's returning null. Let's now add our first exception, and you don't add exceptions, you throw exceptions. Let me show you exactly what I mean by that. So we're going to do a check to see if the file exists. So if the file does not exist, then this negative condition will be met, and in which case we need to throw an exception. The way we do that is we use a throw keyword, throw new exception. An exception, the one that we're using here, is found in the global namespace and hence the \. Now the exception constructor takes three optional parameters. We're just going to use the first one, which is a message. And when we refresh, you see we have a uncaught exception, and there's our message. The file system inventory JSON could not be found, and it tells you which file name and line, etc. So let's consider the terminology that was used there. It says uncaught exception because not only can you throw exceptions, you can also catch exceptions, and this is how we do it. First of all, we create a try block. This is the code that we wish to try. If an exception is thrown during the execution of that code, then we can catch it using a catch block. So you can't create a try block without also having an associated catch block, which is what we're creating here. This is the exception that we're going to catch, and then we can do whatever handling we wish to do with this exception inside of this block. Let's go and have a look at the exception class to see what's available to us. So here's the exception class in a PHP global namespace. There's our optional parameters. As we said, we included a message in ours. And so here's the methods. We can get message, we can get the code, file, line, you can get the trace in case there's a backtrace of exceptions, previous exception, and we can get the trace as a string. So think about this. This is really good. You can get all this information off the exception class. You can get the a custom message. You can get the file name. You can get the line of the file, a backtrace of previous exceptions if this is part of something else which has thrown an exception. So really good debugging information there. And we're going to use some of it here. So we'll get the message. It will say in which file the exception was thrown, and we'll say on which line of that file the exception was thrown. And then what we need to do is go back over to browser, refresh that, and there's our message. So the file system inventory JSON could not be found in file blah 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 on the line 12. So imagine if you've written an open source package and other developers are using this is going to be really helpful for them if they have errors, to go and track exactly where that error has happened. I'm just going to go back and switch this back to the happy path version so that it works again, just to illustrate to you and make sure it's clear for you how this works. So if there are no exceptions thrown, then the catch block won't be executed, and this line here won't actually be reached. And I want to trigger a different kind of error. So in inventory JSON, I'm just going to remove a comma, which means that this is now badly formatted invalid JSON. Refresh, and we have an uncaught type error because we're expecting an array to be returned, but null is being returned, which means we must be getting null from our JSON decode method. Let's go and have a look at that now. I'm using PHP Storm, so I can actually look at the JSON decode method by hitting Command B on a Mac, and so it tells me that null is returned if the JSON cannot be decoded, which is exactly what's happening to us here. What I would like to do is be able to make a distinction between the exceptions being thrown in each scenario that we've just looked at. So what I'm going to do is create an exceptions folder inside of the chapter 4 folder. I'm going to create custom exceptions, one for file not found and one for bad JSON. So I create a class, file not found exception. This is going to extend exception, so I can extend the PHP exception class just like I extend any of the classes which I've created myself. I'm going to give it a namespace of app/exceptions, and I need to make sure it's extending the correct exception. So because it's in the global namespace, it has this backslash prepended to it. If I didn't prepend that backslash, then PHP will go looking for the exception in the app exceptions namespace. So very important to remember that. In the same folder and in the same namespace, I'm creating bad JSON exception. And this will also just extend the PHP global exception. So as you can see, the namespace is app exceptions and class bad JSON exception extends exception with a backslash. Back in the read file as associative array method, I'm changing the exception to a file not found exception. And then after I've attempted to decode my content into an items array, I'm just going to check if items is not set, then I shall throw a bad JSON exception. And I'll also give this a custom message of its own, and so we'll know the difference between the two. Now, the main reason that I've created separate ones is because if you have separate exceptions which you can distinguish, then you can have different ways of catching and handling each one. So in my catch block, which I'd already created, I'm going to use a file not found exception, and I can actually chain on more catch blocks. And so I'm chaining on a second catch block, and in that I'm going to use my bad JSON exception. So if a file not found exception is thrown, then this block will execute here. And I'm actually going to create a file name variable so I can use it in multiple places. So file name is files inventory JSON. I'll pass that to the read file as associative array, and I'll also use it in my error handling here. So the file name could not be found. Then for bad JSON exception, then I can give this custom error handling of its own. So we're not handling everything the same way. By having multiple catch blocks, we can say, if this happens, then do this. If this happens, then do that. And it's just a much more flexible system. Let's go and give this a whirl. So it should trigger our bad JSON exception because we didn't fix that. And there we go. The files inventory JSON, not properly formatted JSON. Only a bad JSON exception was thrown and it was caught by our catch block here. Now here's another scenario. You can actually group your exceptions. Say for example we have a load of processing here and a load of processing here, and then we try to read the file. So you could say that our file not found exception and our bad JSON exception are related. In which case you can group them, and you do that using the pipe symbol. So what we'd be doing is saying if a file not found exception or if a bad JSON exception is thrown, then catch it here and handle it in this catch block. If neither of those are thrown and we have other catch blocks, then it'll just move on to the sequential catch blocks. So we can throw in the global exception there and handle that as like a catch-all in case any other exceptions are thrown. And that's quite a common handling scenario that you might see. And so I may have some custom exception handling for my custom exceptions and then just some kind of catch-all handling for my non-custom ones. So that was triggered because we have bad JSON. What I'll do is I'll go and fix the bad JSON in the inventory JSON file, and I'll actually go and break the file path again just to show that the same exception is being, or the same catch block is being used for both of those. So same catch block, different file name. The file system inventory JSON cannot be processed. And as you can see, that's the handling that we have inside of this catch block here. The final thing I'm going to show you is the finally block, and the finally block will always execute, and it will execute after your catch blocks or block has executed. And this is typically used for things like any final processing that you need to do, such as closing down database connections or closing any files which might be opened, things like that. The way it works is like this. After the final catch block, I add a finally block, and as you can see here, I'm just going to pretend that I'm doing some final processing. Over to the browser, refresh, and as you can see, some final processing has been appended. So what just happened here was that this catch block executed first, and then after that, as a bit of tidy up, the finally block executed after that. And so just to show you that this always executes, I'm going to remove any kind of errors, refresh, and so there's our array, and on the end of that still is the some final processing string. So it will always execute whether there are exceptions or not. So hopefully all of that was clear. If you do have any questions, comments or feedback, be sure to leave those in the discussion down below. Hope you've enjoyed this one. If you have, be sure to give it a like, and don't hesitate to share if you want to help other developers like yourself. That's what good developers do. Also, if you want YouTube to show you more of my content, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon. I release new recordings 2 times a week. Details of my schedule can be found on the discussion tab of my YouTube channel homepage. See you at the next one.